heavy iron boiler in the basement let out a rhythmic, metal-on-metal scream, vibrating the floorboards until the flour dust danced like gray snow in the air. Evelyn pressed her palm against the searing hull, watching the pressure gauge needle twitch frantically into the crimson zone. Outside, through a circle wiped in the window's condensation, silhouettes in expensive cashmere coats were already driving iron stakes into the frozen earth, marking the bakery's boundaries like a grave. They didn't look at the windows. They simply pointed at the roofline and traced lines of demolition in the morning mist. When the brass bell gave a sharp, mournful chime, it wasn't a customer who stepped in, but a man who slammed a leather portfolio onto the counter with the force of a gavel. He didn't offer a greeting, only a gold-plated pen and a contract that smelled of fresh ink and old threats. As Evelyn reached for the document, she didn't look at the man, but at her partner, Ruth, who stood in the shadows of the kitchen. Ruth wasn't reaching for a tray or a knife. She was white-knuckled, gripping a marble rolling pin with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. Not at the stranger, but at Evelyn. Evelyn McAllister gripped the heavy iron key, its surface pitted with age and cold enough to bite into her palm. She thrust it into the lock of the front door. The mechanical protest of the tumblers echoed through the hollow silence of Johnstown. A sharp, metallic screech that seemed to vibrate against the brick walls of the neighboring buildings. It was that hour before dawn when the world felt abandoned. To the east, the skeletal remains of the shuttered steel mills stood like ancient monuments to a forgotten prosperity, their corrugated metal sheets groaning as the wind whipped against them. Every shift of the air brought the scent of river mud and oxidized iron, a heavy, damp smell that clung to the lungs. As Evelyn pushed the door open, the bakery itself seemed to exhale. The floorboards beneath her boots emitted a low, rhythmic moan, a sound of structural fatigue that felt more like a greeting than a warning. Inside, the darkness held the ghost of yesterday's warmth, the faint, lingering aroma of toasted grain now buried under a layer of cold ash and fine flour dust. She reached for the switch, and the overhead bulb flickered to life with a buzzing protest, casting a jaundiced, trembling light over the empty glass display cases. The descent into the cellar was a journey into the bowels of the building, where the air grew thick with the smell of damp concrete and ancient grease. Evelyn moved toward the boiler, a massive iron beast that had served 3 generations of McAllisters. She reached for the main valve, her fingers closing around the flaking, painted wheel. With a grunt of exertion, she forced the metal to turn. The pipes deep within the walls responded with a series of violent, choking coughs, a staccato of clanging iron that vibrated through the soles of her shoes. Suddenly, the boiler let out an atmospheric roar, an indomitable guttural sound that made the very foundations of the bakery shudder. Evelyn pressed her hand against the vibrating hull. The heat rose rapidly, searing through the grime on the metal. Somewhere inside the cast iron belly, a mechanical component began to shriek, a rhythmic, grinding metal-on-metal scream. Flakes of rust and old scale detached from the ceiling pipes, drifting down like gray snow onto the damp floor. A jet of steam hissed from a hairline fracture in a seam, whistling with the piercing intensity of a pressure cooker. Evelyn recoiled, her eyes locked on the analog gauge. The needle jumped, twitching erratically into the crimson zone, vibrating with a frantic energy that suggested the entire assembly was seconds away from a catastrophic rupture. She retreated upstairs, her heart hammering a rhythm against her ribs that matched the boiler's mechanical distress. Standing by the large front window, she used a corner of her flour-streaked apron to wipe a circle in the condensation. The street outside was a study in monochromatic gloom, but through the shifting mist, she saw them. Dark, sharp-edged silhouettes moved with a purpose that felt alien to the crumbling sidewalk. These were men in cashmerevoy coats, their silhouettes crisp against the blurred backdrop of the town. One man, tall and possessing an air of clinical detachment, unrolled a large architectural blueprint. The paper fought him, snapping and flapping in the wind like the wings of a trapped bird. Another man stepped onto the small patch of weed-choked earth that served as the bakery's meager frontage and drove a pointed surveying stake into a crack in the asphalt with a single, brutal movement. Evelyn watched, her breath hitching as their polished leather shoes trampled the frost-covered grass. They didn't look at the windows. Instead, they pointed at the roofline of McAllister's heritage, their fingers tracing lines of demolition in the air. They tapped at tablets, the glow of the screens reflecting in their eyes as they methodically measured the boundaries of her existence, treating her life's work as a mere set of coordinates on a grid. The door's brass bell gave a diminutive, mournful chime as Ruth Hanson slipped inside. Usually, Ruth entered with a flurry of chatter about the morning chill or the state of the local gossip. But today, she was a ghost. She clutched a threadbare shawl tightly around her thin shoulders, her face pale and drawn in the sickly yellow light of the shop. Ruth hung her coat on the peg without a word. The only sound, the dry rustle of the fabric against the wood. Evelyn opened her mouth to speak, to ask if the men outside had said anything. But Ruth avoided her gaze with a desperate, frantic intensity. The younger woman moved toward the prep table, her steps mechanical and jerky. She began to wipe the stainless steel surface, her movements excessive, scrubbing at spots that didn't exist. When Evelyn took a tentative step toward her, seeking the comfort of their usual morning rhythm, Ruth spun away, heading for the back shelves. She kept her face deep in the shadows of the pantry, her shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. The air between them thickened, saturated with a silent, acidic tension that smelled of unvoiced panic and the sharp tang of a secret. The peace, such as it was, shattered when the front door was flung open with a violent crash. The heavy wood struck the interior wall, sending a vibration through the floorboards. A man in a slate-gray suit stepped inside, bringing with him a cloud of expensive cologne and the sharp, chemical odor of exhaust fumes. This was James Walters. Though he didn't introduce himself, he didn't need to. He moved with the entitlement of a man who bought and sold city blocks before lunch. Without a word of greeting, he swept a pile of cooling racks aside and slammed a heavy leather portfolio onto the counter. Evelyn watched his manicured fingers, nails buffed to a shine, as they extracted a thick document. The contract was a dense thicket of legalese, the fine print shimmering under the flickering bulb. Walters slid the paper across the wood toward her, his finger landing on a signature line at the bottom. The figure listed there for the buyout was insulting, a fraction of what the land alone was worth in any fair market. He tossed a gold-plated fountain pen on top of the paper. It rolled a few inches, the light catching its polished surface, before coming to rest. Walters leaned back, his lips curling into a practiced, predatory thinness that was meant to pass for a smile, waiting for her to sign away 3 generations of history. When Evelyn didn't move, Walter's posture shifted. He leaned over the counter, invading her space until she could smell the coffee on his breath and the coldness in his eyes. He began to drum his fingers on the contract, a rhythmic, irritating sound that mimicked a ticking clock. The faux politeness evaporated, replaced by a voice that was dry, hard, and stripped of all pretense. He spoke of the city council, dropping names of men Evelyn had known since childhood, men who had apparently already been bought and paid for. He detailed the inevitable, the lawsuits that would drain her remaining savings, the accidental service interruptions, the arrival of the sheriff's deputies to pile her grandmother's chairs in the mud of the gutter. He leaned closer still, his pupils narrowing to pinpricks. He told her that tonight would be the last night she had running water, that tomorrow the lights would fail, and that by the end of the week, the bulldozers would be idling at her door. "This is the only exit that doesn't end in the dirt," he hissed, his hand hovering over the pen. "Sign it, Evelyn. Walk away with something, or stay and lose everything for a pile of bricks." Evelyn reached out, her hand steady despite the roar of the boiler in the basement. She didn't pick up the pen. Instead, she grasped the edges of the thick contract with 2 fingers, as if handling something diseased. With a sudden, explosive motion, she flicked her wrist, sending the portfolio and its contents flying into Walter's chest. The pages erupted from the folder, a white spray of paper that fluttered and hissed as it scattered across the grimy floorboards. She stepped around the counter, her stature seeming to grow in the cramped space. Her voice, when it came, was a hammer blow, resonant and iron-willed, drowning out the mechanical groans of the building. "Get out," she commanded, her fists clenched at her sides, her eyes burning with a ferocity that made Walters flinch. She didn't wait for him to gather his dignity or his scattered threats. She moved toward him, a force of nature in a flour-dusted apron, forcing him to backpedal toward the entrance. He stumbled over the threshold, his mouth hanging open in shock. Evelyn reached for the door, and with a final, deafening chime of the bell, she slammed it shut, the glass rattling in its frame just inches from his reddening face. She stood there for a long moment, her chest heaving, her back pressed against the solid wood of the door as if her weight alone could keep the world at bay. Slowly, she turned her head toward the back of the kitchen. Ruth was still standing by the heavy wooden table, her fingers white-knuckled as she gripped a heavy marble rolling pin. Evelyn looked for a spark of solidarity, a shared moment of triumph over the corporate vulture. But what she saw made her blood run cold. Ruth wasn't cheering. She was trembling, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The younger woman's eyes were wide, darting toward the door and then back to Evelyn, filled with the frantic desperation of a creature caught in a snare. Ruth's lower lip quivered, and she took a stumbling step backward, retreating into the shadows of the prep area. It wasn't the look of a partner. It was the look of someone who had just watched a bridge burn while they were still standing on it. Evelyn realized then that the silence in the room wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of a house divided against itself. The morning's work had to begin, regardless of the war at the door. Evelyn moved to the large flour hopper, her movements practiced and grim. She reached for the heavy iron lever that released the bulk flour into the industrial mixer. She pulled, expecting the familiar, soft cascade of white powder. But the machine groaned. A sickening, metallic screech tore through the air, the sound of steel teeth grinding against an obstruction. She killed the power and climbed the small stepladder to peer into the hopper's maw. The sight made her stomach turn. The white landscape of the flour was marred by ugly, oily streaks. Someone had poured a quart of used motor oil into the grain, the black sludge seeping deep into the supply. She reached in, her fingers brushing against something sharp. She pulled her hand back, a thin line of red blooming across her palm. Buried within the flour were hundreds of shards of broken glass, glinting like diamonds in the filth. She checked the secondary bags. Every one of them had been methodically sliced open, the contents spilled and contaminated. The heavy, sweet scent of the grain was gone, replaced by the acrid, chemical stench of the oil and the faint smell of burning rubber from the strained motor. The day's entire production was a total loss, a mountain of poisoned white dust. Evelyn didn't cry. She couldn't afford the luxury. She dropped to her knees on the cold concrete floor in front of the mixer's drive assembly, grabbing a heavy wrench and a handful of rags. She began to dismantle the housing, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The black grease from the sabotage smeared across her arms, mixing with the flour dust to create a gray, sticky paste. She worked with a frantic, focused energy, digging out the glass shards from the delicate gears, her fingers catching on the sharp edges until her hands were a map of small, stinging cuts. Every turn of the wrench was a battle. The machinery, usually so reliable, seemed to resist her, the metal cold and stubborn. She scrubbed at the oily residue with a rag soaked in vinegar, the fumes stinging her eyes and throat. She was a woman possessed, a mechanic fighting to save a dying heart. She wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of a blackened hand, leaving a dark, tribal streak across her brow. She knew this wasn't an accident. This was the first tactical strike, a subversion meant to break her spirit before the physical walls even came down. She was still on the floor when a movement outside caught her eye. She rose slowly, peering through the grimy side window that faced the alley. Across the street, James Walters stood by his black sedan, his cashmere coat pristine despite the morning's confrontation. He wasn't alone. Standing beside him was a man in the tan uniform of the city's building department, the head inspector, a man Evelyn had served coffee to for 20 years. She watched as Walters leaned in, speaking in low, confidential tones, a thin smile returning to his face. The inspector nodded, his expression one of bored complicity. Then, Evelyn saw the exchange. Walters reached into his inner pocket and produced a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was heavy, bulging with more than just paper. The inspector took it with a practiced, casual grace, sliding it into the pocket of his jacket without even looking at it. He patted the pocket once, then pulled out a clipboard. He began to write, his pen moving quickly as he stared at the facade of the bakery, citing violations from across the street. Evelyn felt a cold, hollow sensation in her chest. The law wasn't coming to protect her. It had been bought and rebranded. The weight of the betrayal felt heavier than the iron machinery. Evelyn walked through the shop, her steps heavy on the uneven floorboards. She reached the front door and threw the heavy oak deadbolt, the sound a final, echoing thud in the quiet room. She moved to each of the tall windows, pulling the security bars across and locking them with a series of sharp, metallic clicks. The bakery was now a fortress, sealed off from the encroaching gray of the Johnstown morning. She looked at the blackened gears of the mixer, the ruined flour, and the trembling woman in the corner. The day had barely begun, and already the walls felt like they were closing in, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke, oil, and the inevitable end of things. She leaned her head against the cool glass of the last window, watching the mist swallow the figures across the street, knowing that the real siege was only just beginning. The darkness inside the bakery became absolute as Evelyn reached for the main electrical panel. The metal felt ice cold against her fingertips. She took a breath, then threw the master breaker with a desperate, downward shove. The expected silence was instantly shattered by a violent, staccato crackling that erupted from behind the wall. A brilliant blue flash illuminated the cracks in the plaster, followed by the terrifying sound of electricity leaping through dead space. For a heartbeat, the smell of ozone filled the room, sharp and metallic, before it was replaced by the thick, sickening odor of melting plastic and scorched copper. The overhead lights didn't just go out. They seemed to die with a final, pathetic hum. Evelyn stood in the sudden, heavy gloom, her hand still resting on the vibrating metal box. Somewhere deep in the guts of the building, a final spark hissed and went silent. The bakery, which had always felt like a living, breathing thing, now felt like a tomb. The silence was no longer the quiet of a resting shop. It was the suffocating stillness of a heart that had stopped beating. Desperate for even a drop of water to clean her hands, Evelyn moved to the industrial sink and gripped the heavy brass handles. She twisted them until the metal groaned, but the expected gurgle of the pipes never came. Instead, the faucet emitted a series of dry, rhythmic gasps, the sound of a lung trying to breathe in a vacuum. A high-pitched, mocking whistle of escaping air echoed through the plumbing, followed by a dull, heavy clanking deep beneath the floorboards. She stared at the drain, which remained bone-dry and dusty. The town had followed through on its threat. They hadn't just turned off a valve, they had severed the connection. She felt a surge of claustrophobia. Without power, the ovens were useless. Without water, the very act of cleaning or prep was impossible. The bakery was being systematically strangled, its life support cut off one line at a time. She had no choice. She grabbed 2 heavy galvanized buckets and pushed through the rear door into the gray, drizzling morning. The backyard was a tangle of wet weeds and rusted equipment, dominated by the ancient stone circle of the well. It had been a decorative relic for decades, a remnant of the original 19th century homestead. Evelyn threw back the rotted wooden cover and hooked a bucket to the rusted chain. The winch screamed as she turned the handle, a piercing metallic wail that seemed to announce her desperation to the entire neighborhood. As the bucket hit the water far below with a hollow splash, she began the long haul back up. A sharp, searing pain exploded in her knees, a reminder of 40 years of standing on hard floors. Her joints ground together like the sabotaged gears of her mixer. She gritted her teeth, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she fought the weight of the water. The chain bit into her palms, reopening the small cuts from the morning's work. Each rotation of the handle was a grueling battle against gravity and her own failing body. By the time the second bucket was full, her vision blurred with exhaustion, and the cold rain had soaked through her clothes, chilling her to the bone. She stumbled back inside, her muscles twitching with fatigue, only to find Ruth waiting in the middle of the kitchen. The younger woman wasn't helping. She was vibrating with a frantic, localized energy. Ruth held a gray, dripping rag in her hand, her face a mask of distorted fury. Without a word of warning, Ruth whipped her arm forward. The wet cloth struck Evelyn across the face with a heavy, sickening slap. The cold, dirty water stung Evelyn's eyes and ran down her neck, smelling of stagnant buckets and floor cleaner. "You're insane," Ruth shrieked, her voice cracking into a jagged edge of hysteria. She stepped into Evelyn's personal space, her chest heaving. "Look at you, carrying water like a peasant. You're dragging me down into this hole with you, Evelyn. It's a pile of rotting wood and debt." Ruth's hands were claws, gesturing wildly at the darkened ceiling. She screamed about her own life, about the years she'd spent in this tomb, and how Evelyn's pride was a poison that was killing them both. The tirade reached a breaking point when Ruth turned toward the wall, where a heavy, dark wood frame hung. Inside, behind a sheet of hand-blown glass, was the original photograph of Josiah McAllister standing before the newly laid brickwork of the bakery. It was the soul of the building. Ruth let out a guttural sound, half sob and half growl, and tore the frame from its mounting. The screech of the nail being wrenched from the wood was like a physical wound. She raised the heavy frame high above her head, her face contorted in a grimace of pure nihilism, and brought it down with all her strength against the corner of the iron prep table. The explosion of glass was magnificent and terrible. Shards sprayed across the floor like diamonds, glinting in the dim light. The old, brittle paper of the photograph tore as the frame buckled, Josiah's face bifurcated by a jagged rip. Ruth stood over the wreckage, her breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches, staring at the ruin of the past while Evelyn watched, the cold well water still dripping from her chin onto the dusty floor. The silence that followed the destruction of the photograph was more oppressive than the darkness. Evelyn moved through the kitchen like a sleepwalker, her mind a numb void. She found herself standing before the open electrical panel again, a fool's hope driving her to try and bridge the gap. She reached into the depths of the box with a pair of insulated pliers, her hands shaking from the cold and the adrenaline. As she brought the frayed copper wires together, the world exploded in a violent, blinding arc of white light. The discharge was so powerful it threw her backward, the pliers clattering to the floor. A spray of molten sparks erupted from the gap, white-hot and hissing like angry hornets. They rained down onto a stack of brown craft paper bags sitting on the lower shelf. For a second, there was only a thin trail of smoke, and then the edge of the paper curled, turned a bruised purple, and burst into a bright, hungry orange flame. The fire didn't hesitate. It found the thin film of flour dust that coated the wooden shelves and used it as a fuse. The flames roared upward, a guttering, predatory sound that filled the small space in seconds. Evelyn watched in horror as the old, oil-soaked wood of the shelving unit caught, the ancient lacquer bubbling and popping like skin. The heat hit her in a physical wave, stinging her eyes and searing the hair on her arms. Thick, oily smoke began to curl toward the ceiling, obscuring the rafters and turning the air into a toxic soup. The fire moved with a terrifying intelligence, licking at the underside of the upper floorboards, the shadows dancing in a frantic, macabre ballet against the soot-stained walls. The bakery, her sanctuary, was transforming into a furnace, the very wood that had sheltered her family for a century now providing the fuel for its own destruction. Evelyn scrambled for the fire extinguisher, her lungs burning with the first intake of smoke. She found the red canister near the back door, but the pin was rusted in place. She hammered at it with the heel of her hand, the metal biting into her skin, until it finally gave way. She turned back to the flames, which had now claimed the entire pantry wall. The roar was deafening, a hungry, living sound that drowned out the wind outside. She squeezed the lever, and a cloud of white chemical powder erupted, clashing with the orange glare. She fought the heat, stepping closer than any sane person would, her skin blistered by the proximity. She swept the nozzle back and forth, a desperate soldier in a losing war, until the last of the visible flames died down into a smoldering, glowing red. She dropped the empty canister, her breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. She stood in the wreckage, the air thick with the smell of scorched earth and chemicals. She lifted her hands to her face, the movement agonizing. In the dim, smoky light, she saw the damage. Her palms were a map of trauma. Large, translucent blisters had risen along the fleshy parts of her hands, the skin pulled taut and shiny. The pain was no longer a dull ache. It was a screaming, white-hot presence that throbbed with every heartbeat. She tried to curl her fingers, but the skin was too tight, the nerves screaming in protest. She looked around her ruined kitchen, at the blackened walls and the gray ash covering everything, and realized she was standing in the remains of a dream. The physical toll had finally caught up to the emotional one, leaving her broken in the center of her own charred history. The morning of the final day arrived not with a bang, but with a cold, insistent drizzle that turned the soot on the windows into gray streaks. Evelyn sat at the scarred wooden table in the front room, a single stack of legal documents resting before her. Her hands were heavily bandaged, the white gauze already stained with the yellow of weeping blisters and the gray of the ash. James Walters sat across from her, his presence a sharp, sterile contrast to the ruin around them. He didn't gloat. He simply waited with the patient boredom of a man who had already won. Beside him, Two lawyers in identical charcoal suits sat with pens poised, their faces as expressionless as the stone statues in the town square. Evelyn looked at the pen. She didn't pick it up immediately. She thought of the month of silence she had demanded, a final 30 days to breathe the air of this place without the shadow of the bulldozer. It was a small concession, a pathetic one, really. But it was all she had left to bargain with. She looked at the signature line, then up at the blackened ceiling where the smoke had left its permanent mark. With a slow, deliberate movement that cost her a sharp spike of pain in her bandaged palm, she gripped the pen. The scratch of the nib against the paper was the loudest sound in the room. She signed her name, Evelyn Mary McAllister, with a steady hand, a final act of agency in a world that had tried to strip it from her. She pushed the papers toward Walters, who nodded once, a curt, professional acknowledgement of her surrender. The lawyers gathered the documents with efficient, rustling sounds and stood to leave, their job finished. An hour later, the shop was empty of suits, but the air remained heavy. Ruth stood by the door, a small suitcase at her feet. She wouldn't look at Evelyn. The betrayal was a physical wall between them now, more solid than the brick and mortar. Ruth reached for the handle, her movements hurried, as if the very air of the bakery were now poisonous to her. She stepped out into the rain without a goodbye, her figure shrinking as she walked toward the bus stop at the end of the block. Evelyn watched her go, a hollow ache in her chest that surpassed the fire's sting. She was alone now, the last McAllister in a house of ghosts. She turned back to the kitchen. There was one bag of flour left that hadn't been touched by the oil or the smoke, hidden in a metal bin beneath the stairs. Her hands screamed as she began the work, but she ignored them. She moved with a rhythmic, ancestral grace, mixing the flour, the water from the well, and the last of the sourdough starter. She couldn't use the industrial mixer, so she worked the dough by hand on the stone counter, the cool mass soothing the heat of her burns through the bandages. She built a small, controlled fire in the brick oven, using the last of the seasoned oak. The heat began to fill the room again, but this time it was the honest, productive heat of the hearth. As the sun began to bleed through the gray clouds, the first loaves came out. They were perfect, golden brown, with a crust that crackled like parchment and a scent that defied the smell of char. It was the smell of Johnstown before the mills closed, the smell of her grandmother's kitchen, the smell of resilience. On the neighboring street, the first low rumble of a demolition crew echoed through the air, the sound of a wrecking ball hitting a distant wall. Evelyn didn't flinch. She took the warm loaves and carried them out to the front porch. A small crowd had gathered. The old men from the square, a few mothers with children, the ghosts of a community that was being erased. Evelyn stood on the sagging wooden steps, the wind tugging at her hair. She didn't say a word. She simply began to break the bread, handing out thick, steaming chunks to anyone who reached out. The bread was a bridge, a final communion. As the residents of Johnstown took the food, their faces softened, a brief flicker of humanity returning to eyes that had seen too much decay. Evelyn watched them, her head held high, the bandages on her hands, a badge of a war she had lost, but a dignity she had kept. The building behind her was doomed, its history marked for the landfill. But as she stood there in the cold morning air, the scent of her bread drifted down the street, a stubborn, beautiful defiance against the coming silence. She walked away from the porch only when the last loaf was gone, leaving the door wide open, her footsteps steady as she turned her back on the ruins and walked toward the horizon.